This is Learning from History, Part 6. That is a wonderful image of Christian O'Brien and Barbara Joy, which was in the Telegraph, something like 1974, I think. That was his main, first really exciting thing, to find that there was a line, which he called Line A, from Hatfield Forest to Wandlebury, 26 megalithic miles, and markers precisely each megalithic mile. Didn't find all of them, but most of them. And it's a loxodrome, which is a curved surface on the line of the Earth, which is parallel to the meridian. And it's essential for what was called meridian astronomy, where astronomy first started. So in 2500 BC, the people living in East Anglia were clever enough to put that marker on the ground. And to do that, they must have known the exact dimensions of the Earth. The really exciting bit now is that this line points west of current due north. And I haven't checked it out yet, but it looks as though it could be pointing to the Hudson Bay North Pole before the Earth was shifted on its axis. And that is part of the story I'm going to tell, and the consequences of that happening, and how that has affected everything that has happened to us over the last 12,000 years. The second really important thing was to establish that there was a major observational astronomy university on Bodmin Moor, with more stones moved than the Great Pyramid. And that was where Druids from all over Europe, most of the known world, came to be taught observational astronomy. That's why we have such incredibly high standards of knowledge in these ancient times, because the traditions were carried down throughout the Druidic colleges and universities. These are the two key books. Some people are calling the Genius of the Few the New Bible, because it really does give you the Bible story in a far more sensible way, not about God in heaven, but about the bright ones, intelligent ones, the shining ones in the planted highlands. It's full of information, in particular an alternative translation of the Genesis text, which now makes sense, and also in great detail the Sumerian story, creation story, or story of the Garden of Eden, which is called Kharsag, and it's the Kharsag Epics from the Nippur Library, which are crucial to our understanding of the past going back in time. The Shining Ones is the masterwork. They're all sold out. I hope later on the year I'll be able to do another print run, but that does depend on support for the DVDs and buying the Genius of the Few. There are the part 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they all break down into component parts. There's some mixing between the two, but about 140 slides on each one, so there's packed full of information on a whole range of subjects. So anybody who I've spoken to quickly for or thrust too much at can go back and look at that. Or also they can look at it too on the Holistic channel, and there's a card downstairs if you want to pick that up and simply look at it on your computer at home. But you won't get the quality and be able to do it as well as you would if you bought a DVD. Now, like every aspect of history, particularly when we're looking at our history of our planet and the people on it, one of the key points we have to do is look at the big picture of our Milky Way galaxy and our solar system. That's a wonderful image, and you can see there the sun just there. That's us. So even before you got up this morning, you were lying on a large stone, which is traveling at 66,600 miles an hour through this extraordinary area of our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, ducking and diving over time through these spiral arms. And that has a major impact on our climate, our weather, and everything that's happening here. And it's only this fantastic research in the last 10 years that should be able to understand that we go from dry periods to wet periods, to hot periods, to cold periods, largely because of the impact of cosmic rays raining down upon us. I put this up because I think it's crucial we look at the size of the Sun, Mercury, Venus, the Earth, Mars, and the other planets, particularly how close we are to Mars and the relationships between those two, which I'm going to touch on later. But if you think that CO2 here is actually going to have any impact on what this chap's doing here, in my opinion, you're completely mad. But that's another story which I'm not going to get into at this moment. The issues about our extraordinary universe are that it needs 20, 30 disciplinary skills to begin to understand what's happening, and in particular begin to look at what has happened. And this is the sun, solar activity, and how we're protected by the magnetic fields that we have and also that go around our particular solar system. And here we have an outer boundary of the heliosphere here, which protects us from radiation from the rest of our galaxy. And it's very, very important to see here that that particular boundary is weakening at the moment, shrinking and getting weaker. And that'll have impacts on our weather in the short and longer term, possibly. The one thing we're worried about in 2012 is this galactic alignment, and that could mean very fierce solar storm from the sun, or something coming into our sun, making the sun very active for a short period of time, which will give us adverse conditions. That's what we've been warned about, not so much by the Mayans, but the Sumerians and the Egyptians all are on the same tack. The teaching originally came from the land of Canaan to Sumeria to the Mayans, and I'm going to show you all those links as we go through. Just some of the problems. There's a lovely image of Comet Hale-Bopp. That's an artist visualization of cometary debris, an actual event that took place over Chesapeake Bay. This is actually a lovely image. First time we've actually photographed a comet of this type in deep space, and that's due to come somewhere near us in about 2016, but I don't think it'll give us any trouble. That is the kind of what we call a dark comet, dark matter, which brightens up and flares as it comes through our atmosphere. That's what happened in Tugunska in Siberia. An area the size of Belgium was devastated. And there is at least a 100 or a centennial risk of this kind of incident now, and an increased risk as we go through the next 100 years. This is the work of Professor Victor Klube, the top Oxford astrophysicist, and you can see here at these particular junctures and these dates, you have problems. We had problems around about 3000. Big problems, 22,400. We had problems here again, 2020, 1300. These are all BC, 500 BC, 280 BC AD, and then 1200. And we're going to run into more problems from the Torrid stream in the next 100 years. He was very worried and concerned about that, and was pretty upset that nobody took him seriously. These are the impacts in recent historical times. There have been 3 Tugunska type events, 1930, 35, and 47. And the 2 big ones I'm going to feature a bit later on are the one of an asteroid hitting the Austrian Alps. There was a television program about that a short while ago, fascinating. It had been forecasted to the day by the Sumerian astronomers using a planisphere and the methods they used to calculate the movements of these kind of objects. Quite staggering. And we've been looking and talking all this last 2 days about how sophisticated observational astronomy was, and how precise and accurate our surveyors and the people who were doing the technical things 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago. And we're going to follow that trail as well. Now, I'm starting with what we call the big event. This is the latest research, the best information from our top scientists about a major event at 10,500 BC. I put 10,750 because there were 2 big heat events here, and our problem is actually the carbon dating, because with the kind of problems we've had big movements up and down with the carbon, which means that our carbon dates always need correcting. And most people know that we've been pushing dates back further and further with more knowledge about dating methods. So debris from a supernova explosion of 39,000 BC, and I'm not going to talk about the other bits, the flash and the shock wave, because I dealt with that in previous talks, but we're talking about debris from a supernova explosion arriving in our solar system at this particular juncture here. This is a typical story of nearly every tribe that has any kind of tradition, and I'm not going to read it all. the creator God told them, appearing, so they saw him, and the creator God said, "Go dig a large pit, cover it with logs, and pile sand over the top. After it is done, seal yourselves up inside the pit for protection." Just as they finished sealing themselves inside, the creator sent a terrible rain of fire and hail down up from the sky to destroy the world. The family began to fear that the pit was not deep enough to protect them, but soon the noise stopped and the roof of the pit grew cooler to touch. Some animals and a few other people survived to rebuild the world. That story appears time and time again, one of the most reliable stories we have on the planet. So there was the existence of somebody regarded as a real person, creator God, at this time. And this was retold from 1880 from Brett, a very good historian on the subject. And it's in this key book, The Cycle of Cosmic Catastrophes, by Richard Farstone, Alan West, and Simon Warwick Smith. Now, who were the people at this time? We have this Clovis-Fulsome boundary, but we need to look at what's happening to us. We're, in reality, certainly on the male side, very, very recent. And all three of these, if you like, so-called races all have a common male Y chromosome at about 50,000 BC, shown by the M158 marker, which is in the blood of all three. We also, believe it or not, have within Sumer an Sumerian Encyclopedia of Astronomy, and it's accredited to Anu and Enil, or An and Enil, and I'm sure many of you have heard about that. These names have been bandied around over the last 50 years in all sorts of areas. But Enuma, I think, in my best interpretation, in the beginning, Anu and Enil, the Sumerian Encyclopedia of Astronomy, a set of tablets. So we have more evidence of key people around their influence 5,000–6,000 BC, and they'd produced an encyclopedia of astronomy. Within these Sumerian records, we have this story, which Sitchin followers will recognize straight away, but other people, other scholars who did not accept Sitchin's work have looked at this in great detail, geologists, and what they're saying is, wow, they've identified all the planets, and they've also identified a missing planet. The missing planet is Tiamat, and it was smashed to pieces in this particular catastrophe when debris came through our system. And this is the same story that Plato talks about Phaeton's chariot being out of control and having a dramatic effect, putting Pluto into a different orbit, affecting Neptune, Uranus, Chiron, the moon there, Saturn being pushed out of the way, big collision here creating the asteroid belt. Mars, close to Mars, maybe this is the time when Mars's atmosphere was stripped away, although it does have some atmosphere now. Kingu launched into Earth, and this large object coming through would have provided sufficient torque to tip the Earth on its axis, and this is a story that we have. Past Venus, putting Venus in a reverse spin, and moving it, maybe even Venus came close to the Earth, we're not sure. But this is the best analysis from two of the top men in the world, Derek Allen and J.B. Dallaire. Derek Allen has now died, but they wrote this fantastic book, which is originally called When the Earth Nearly Died, and is now called Cataclysm. That's the Farstone book, and the big impact, looking at a big impact here, and all the heavy metals in this area, and all the clues we have, the Carolina Bays, Dismal Bay, a radioactive Earth from objects coming in from space. And those objects would have contained ice, water that had frozen, nitrogen gas, which would have frozen, supercooled, which has frozen the Earth down to 200 or 300 feet when it clouded in, maybe over Siberia. Absolutely extraordinary period of time when the Earth was in absolute turmoil, and the Earth's crust was being moved very, very dramatically, far more dramatically than anybody in this room can imagine. And this is what our geologists are now telling us in order to be able to get the correct record of what ice ages were all about and what our geology and crustal movements are all about, and why we have very old rocks on top of new rocks, young rocks. The reconstruction of the world before the catastrophe, we're looking at a very large amount of land. You see the coastline of England here and the continental shelf, which we can see, very solid. We know this is all very solid because the Earth's crust is very thick here, and it runs from Africa out to the Azores and the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is very important. I'm going to come to that later. And it runs across here, and we find that we've got solid land right the way across from Africa to South America. A great sea in the middle of the Sahara Desert, which explains so much of the geology there. And in fact, we've got a situation where we have a massive sea from the Austria, Germany area, Hungary area, right the way across to the Aral Sea. And that includes the Black Sea and the area around the north of the Black Sea, the geological evidence for that being underwater as recently as 10,000 years ago. The interesting features here, Graham Hancock was talking about Japan and that being above sea level before the catastrophe. There was quite a lot of evidence of that. I researched the subject for him when he started on Yonaguni, and my conclusion then, talking to Japanese experts, was that this land along this ridge here, on which Yonaguni Island was part, down here, had in fact been coming upwards. It was right on the edge of what we call caudal plate, and at that time I thought that it was a natural object. I think there's still a debate over that subject, but his material last night was very impressive and interesting, and always we have to keep an open mind, always be prepared to change our minds, always be prepared to search for the truth. The Druid motto was the secular pursuit of knowledge above everything, and that's really what's so important today. This is the power of a tsunami. This is one which came down, a large object in the Indian Ocean, and actually these cliffs are 600 feet high, chevrons of debris picked up by a tsunami. So the tsunami was about 1,000 feet high. So if you don't believe in 1,000-foot-high tsunamis coming out of the oceans and the seas, there is a perfect example, practical example of what actually happens. 3 miles in from the ocean, it deposited all that material. We see them along the coast of Australia, many parts of the world. Britain had one as recently as 1608 up the Severn Estuary. We had a much bigger one, I think about 7,500 BC, and we're only just beginning to understand and see what it all means. Now, the message of axis shift, the Earth tipping on its axis during this cataclysm, is encoded in the Great Pyramid and in the layout of other early structures around the planet, including written records, particularly the books of Enoch. And of course, Thoth, Hermes, Mercury are all different names for the same person. This is the Hebrew word for the same individual, a great historian who provided these records for us, and we've only really just begun to understand how to translate his work, and that's a feature of O'Brien's work within the Genius of the Few. But my message that I'm putting to you is that we have, if we look at the evidence, proof that there was an advance, the existence of an advanced civilization. Our ancestors were wonderful, benevolent people who went to enormous trouble to leave messages, laws, social organization par excellence for us. Forget the conspiracy theory. They're all things that have happened in the last 3,000-4,000 years when we lost it. We lost the golden age. It collapsed, and it collapsed because of another great catastrophe around about 2346, which I'm going to touch on. This is the book. I've written part of this book, a very small part, with John Gagnon, who is a Canadian researcher, fabulous man in my opinion, and it's The Great Pyramid and the Hudson Bay Pole. And this is the message left for us within the Great Pyramid. Now what we're saying is that the Earth was hit over Hudson Bay and it was tipped on its axis, which meant that the ice cap, the Arctic ice cap, was moved into the temperate zone in this direction. That's the reason for all the rapid melting, and also the complete misunderstanding by geologists of ice ages. It just needs, we now have to rewrite all the books and the knowledge about ice ages and where ice formed. And we can now do that from the evidence we've got. The one good thing about all the debate on climate change is that it's focused everybody's attention onto the kind of research that needs looking at very carefully in order to be able to sort out the wheat from the chaff or the truth from the nonsense. And so hopefully a lot of good will come from the debate, providing we don't waste any money and spend the £500 billion to start with totally unnecessarily. And probably the wrong things, because we probably need to be thinking about the Earth getting cooler rather than warmer. This is the King's Chamber, which you're all familiar with in the Great Pyramid, and there are star shafts. And Robert Bauval did a lot of the early work, and other people too. But what John Gagnon is saying, that these shafts pointed to the Alpha Draconis, which is the North Star, Zeta Orionis, the South Star, and the Orion's in the Orion's belt. It's very important because that is reproduced on the ground for very good reason. We find the same offset in the Chinese pyramid, big Chinese pyramid, and there are all the clues. What Hancock was talking about at Angkor Wat is, in my opinion, was that they knew at Angkor Wat about this axis shift, and what they had to do is to do a tremendous amount of work to recalibrate everything, to take into account the fact that the Earth had tipped. And they knew that. So that our understanding of it now, once we realize and accept axis shift, we can understand what so many of our astroarchaeologists are all been trying to do and work on. The Queen's Chamber shaft show where the Alpha Draconis and Zeta Orionis were when or before the catastrophe happened. So the Earth was tipped, and that is recorded for us, a message for us in the two chambers, Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. But we know about all the mathematics which is encoded in the Great Pyramid. But what we're looking at is a great deal more than we ever realized. This is, for example, the measurement of 28 degrees, Giza before the event and after the event. But about half of that is made up of the movement of the Earth's crust, would you believe, as well as the fact that the Earth tipped on its planet. So we had massive disruptions to the Earth crust. And if you talk to a sea level man, he will not know enough about geology. And if you talk to a geology man, he will not know enough about sea level. So the difficulty in doing research on this subject is actually finding people with broad enough minds and detailed enough research to really be able to pin these issues down. And I believe that John Gagnon here has done that better than anybody. We have the orientation of the Great Pyramid causeways. I'm going to talk about these pyramids. These causeways, in my opinion, were to get people into the structures and around the structures very quickly when there was a warning that trouble was coming. And here we have 14 degrees and 14 degrees, which equals the 28 you saw on the previous slide. And something like 14% of that 14 degrees shift of axis, and the rest of it was 14 degrees shift of the Earth's crust. That's how dramatic it was. And here within the Great Pyramid we have this recorded again, the mathematical representation of Earth's changes. Giza was at 16 degrees, but stars aligned as if at 2 degrees axis shift, and that is adjusted in here. And all these points and markers within the Great Pyramid tell us a whole range of things, astronomical things about these times. So it doesn't take much to see just what incredibly sophisticated people our ancestors actually were, and what they've done for us. There is we have a big crater in the Hudson Bay, we have the Great Lakes crater, and we have a crater in Prince Edward Island, and others around the planet. That was all part of this bombardment of debris from the supernova explosion, which would have gone right the way through our own galaxy. Here is a good example. That would have been thick with ice, maybe 2 miles of ice. But we still have a situation where it disrupted the actual Earth's crust, and volcanic rock came out on this edge, and we have lots of evidence of a big impact here, even though we had 2 miles of ice protecting us. We've still got lots of evidence on the ground on that point. This is the ice. What we know here is that we've got a 1 kilometer rebound in this area. And that 1 kilometre rebound is this business of the land coming back up again after the hit. And people have put that down, oh, it was the weight of the ice that pushed it down. But now we're looking at that, or the experts are looking at that in a different way. There is the Great Lakes crater, Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. You can see a crater, kind of crater there. This was a 6-foot high erratic boulder which was blasted 1,000 miles from the Belcher Islands in Hudson Bay to North Dakota. It's the only place you find this particular rock, Belcher Islands, and there was loads of it scattered over North Dakota, a long way away. Carolina Bays, you know about those, most of you, and all the bays here, you see the direction, they all point back either to the Great Lakes or to Hudson Bay. And another big impact too over Finland, and we've all been told that Finland and this area of Sweden, that's all coming up and rising. I've been to Finland and seen it's been going up quite quickly even now. Finland was below sea level at one point, but they've all put that down to the fact that the ice has melted and therefore it's coming up because the weight of the ice is there no more. But we have another reason for that and another impact crater. Are ancient sites aligned to the Hudson Bay Pole? And Teotihuacan, I can't pronounce it, but you know what I mean, southern Mexico, fantastic site, aligned 15 degrees northeast to the Hudson Bay. Tiwanaku, I can pronounce that one. And it's actually much lower, a bit lower down, I think, but never mind. But that also seems to be aligned to the Hudson Bay Pole. And messages left, very important. And this is Mexico. We've actually got a very clear 15-degree on that fantastic avenue, which you all remember, that lovely photograph. And there may well have been civilizations on this site going back much further than we realize. And as I say, that points to the Hudson Bay North Pole. The alignment is to the Hudson Bay North Pole, a message for us. Tiwanaku, similar situation where you've got a 4-degree offset to the actual, that's the north today, that was the north in 10,400 BC. That's a lovely view over Lake Titicaca looking north up the Andes. This is a very, very interesting area, all sorts of features here. I'm going to touch on some of those. Copper in Bolivia, Tiwanaku's in Bolivia. We had the most fantastic city of all, Pachacamac, which has been excavated and looked at by a couple called the Verrills, but hasn't entered the mainstream of archaeology, which is a shame. And there's a tremendous amount of information here which has just escaped everybody, because what was being said was that was Sumerian. Those were the Indus Valley peoples who had colonized this part of the world as early as 4000 BC. The idea that everything developed independently on the planet is the most woolly, ludicrous suggestion ever made. Now, axis shift is followed by more than 1,000 years of ice age conditions. Globally, it's called the Younger Dryas. The planet starts to warm up again around 9,500 BC with vegetation marching north from glacial refuges. So the Younger Dryas was as cold as anything we've ever seen before on the planet, and it was for 1,000 years. So you can imagine the dramatic effect that had on the whole planet, not just the northern regions. And so we have to look at where were the places that the key plants, the wheats, and the wild grasses, which eventually became wheat and barley, the pistachio, the oak, a lot of these, the olive, where those things actually came from? Where were the glacial refuges? And plants are great because when the weather comes out nicely and they get rain on them, and they're off. The seeds blow away in the wind, and you know, but some weeds can invade whole countries. Give them a couple of thousand years, it's amazing what plants can do. So what we had to have at that particular juncture, and what I'm going to explain to you now, was a restart of agriculture and civilization. The name is Eden, but the Sumerians called it Kharsag, which means head enclosure. Khar, well, like gar or garden, means enclosure. Sag means head. And if you want to look at the Proto-Sumerian language, the vertical picture signs, which go back 5,000 or 6,000 BC, from which the cuneiform came from, you can see that downstairs on the Hephaestus disc. And the Phaistos disc is a lovely story about the great cattle of the great lords and the great lady breaking out of the field, knocking over the beehives, causing absolute mayhem, and having to be rounded up and put back in again. Classic, typical farming story. It does, I think, double as a calendar for some of the more mathematically minded people, but it's a fantastic object, and it would have been taken to Crete by the time of Menes. Menes and Minos are the same person. And Menes was, in fact, the son of Sargon I, and he was the governor of the Indus Valley colony of the Sumerians when they decided to break everything up and have individual areas. Then he became king of Egypt, and the reason for that was another great catastrophe, which we're going to touch on. So what we have here is the restart of agriculture and civilization at Kharsag by the survivors of the cataclysm, led by An, who was always a monotheistic system led by An, always. Enlil, Ninkarsag, and Enki. And you'll recognize these names. You'll certainly recognize archangels, angels, and watchers, who were the teachers and craftsmen. And there were three orders. These guys were called two-eyed serpents, they were called one-eyed serpents, and they were just called watchers because they were looking and watching. But they didn't have the two eyes the archangels had. And of course they were promoted up the ranks depending on how good they were. And a representative of the watchers always sat on the Anunnaki, or Archangel's Council. So 9,500 BC, we find at the end of this Younger Dryas extreme cold period, things picking up. Now these are what are called the culture bearers, who took education, knowledge, this advanced civilization all around the world. The earliest known settlements are in this Rift Valley from the Dead Sea here, very important, up to this area here. And we've got the natural habitat for wild emmer in green, this area here. That is a glacial refuge, a key glacial refuge for many of the crops, wild plants that became the domesticated crops. And I've dealt with that in previous lectures. Very, very important. And domesticated animals also, we're getting animals arriving here along with the domesticated crops all about the same time in about the same area. And this is the southern limit of rain-fed agriculture at this time, on this red line. So rain-fed agriculture was important, but in reality, they had to have irrigation to make it work. Any farmer knows that you have to control water all the time to be able to have a successful farming operation. So it had to be irrigation right from the start, and we're going to look at that. The blue sites are very early Paleolithic, Epi-Paleolithic sites. And then we have what's called the pre-pottery Neolithic. They couldn't find any pottery, so they called it pre-pottery Neolithic. But it relates to Jericho, Angazar, Tel Aswar, which is very close to Damascus. And we're going to be looking at a site just here, very close, as the site for the Garden of Eden and Kharsag. Other earliest known settlements up in Syria, Jurf el-Ama, Tel Abba, Muribet, Abu Huraira, Sabi Abiyad just here, which is a very, very ancient town, a little bit later on, and the other towns from the Zagros, and then down into the Mesopotamian plains. Now, the key evidence which supports this thesis is following this trail of agriculture. And this research was produced just over a year ago now by these three people. And they looked at 735 archaeological sites and to trace the origins of agriculture. And they picked out these 10 probable centers of origin. And so we have these sites here as the most likely place for the start of agriculture. And this is for agriculture worldwide, because this is where you find the earliest dates and many of the crops. And even maize being found here at 7,500 BC, which was dismissed by the establishment, but that decision was made by two of the finest botanists, Dutch botanists, Botemer and Zeist. But because they said something that didn't fit in with the establishment view, they literally lost their reputations. And this is the problem. Who's going to tell us the truth if they step over the line, the establishment line? And this is our big problem today, as you know. Very interesting, because you average these sites out, you come down somewhere in the region of Damascus here. Very important. Now, this is where the gods chose to come. They chose the Bekaa Valley, which is between these two mountains, the Lebanon Mountains and the anti-Lebanon Mountains, and Mount Hermon is here, and we're going to look at Mount Hermon. And this is the river Dan, which goes down just above Galilee, and this is Jesus' favourite place, was just below Mount Hermon here. And there's a lot talked about him going there and going up into this area here. Then we have Galilee, and we have several 5 or 6 intermontane valleys, which, as they're called, into the Sea of Galilee, where tremendous sophistication has been found at about 8000 BC. And then down here we go down, this drops down, so when it gets to Jericho, it's about 600 feet below sea level, then the Dead Sea. But we're finding lots of early agriculture and settlements here. And one of the top American agricultural specialists said farming must have started between Jericho and Damascus, which I'm going to show you it did. This is Christian O'Brien's produced this map. It was based on a French Ordnance Survey map to look at all the possible locations in this area. And as one of the world's top geologists, he was able to read maps and do all sorts of incredible things with maps. When he first met my aunt, he was taken to see my Uncle Pat, who was my aunt's father, he said, like all elderly guys, "And what do you do, young man?" And Christian O'Brien said, "Well, I've just been working out how far the Rocky Mountains have moved in the last 30 million years. And he had, and I got an incredible geology document of that particular work, which was published. But he looked at these sites, and he identified this as the best location. He had the Sumerian records, he had the geology, he had all sorts of clues here about Sacred Mountain, the home of the sons of God, and in particular the books of Enoch, because Enoch was taken up to see the great Lord up in heaven or up in here, and to record all that was going on. And that's another key clue. So we have the Genesis text, we have the books of Enoch, and we have the Sumerian records, 3 totally independent sources to establish the story. So there is the Garden of Eden site. It's an old lake bed. It's drained down there, or was drained down there. At the moment it gets flooded because, would you believe, the old watercourse, the great watercourse, which drained the lake to make farming possible, was destroyed during what they called a 1,000-year storm. And it's all documented in the Sumerian records, which were found in the Nippur Library in 1898 by a team from the University of Pennsylvania. And they stayed in the basement of the University of Pennsylvania for quite a long while. And it was only recently, thanks to Samuel Noah Kramer, and in particular Christian O'Brien, that these documents have been translated. And of course nobody accepts it or wants to know about it, but that's another story. Looking across the basin, we can see where the actual Enlil's great house was. There was a reservoir in this valley here, which was perfect for collecting water from the flanks of Mount Hermon. And here we have even now, a fabulous fertile basin. That is not far from Enlil's house on the hill, looking down into the valley, and it's the rainwater coming down into this valley, which allows water to be collected for a reservoir. And here we have another wonderful view of the kind of limestone rocks here and how level that area was. So it could be irrigated on a big scale, very important. This is the story we're all familiar with. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And a river. Now, a river is a translation of a word, but it could just as easily mean watercourse. And what O'Brien was suggesting, and I'm suggesting, is it does mean watercourse. Went out of Eden to water the garden. Now, rivers don't go out of Eden to water gardens, but watercourses do. And this adds to it. From whence it was parted. Well, you don't part rivers. Most rivers have a whole load of tributaries come into one main river. But if it was parted, we're talking about sluices. And then even more confirming, we have, and became into 4 heads, irrigation channels, 4 irrigation channels. The name of the first is Pison. Name of the second river or channel is Gihon. Name of the third river, Hedikal. And this is an interesting little point. That is which goes towards the east of Assyria. Well, Assyria wasn't even invented until about 8,500 years after the actual event itself. So you can see how this story has been lost in time, but basically it's right. And so much of the Bible is basically right, needs retranslating, needs looking at in a more constructive way, and to realize just how much we've lost over time of the original translations and how it's been put together for people to pump their own particular version of events. That's typical of history. It's always written by the victors or people who want to manipulate and control other people. You don't get paid much for telling the truth. And somebody once said that if you tell a lie, you're very unpopular. But if you tell the truth, you really upset people. So here we have it. Here we have a reservoir, Enniel's Great House, buildings, and these are not the actual placements, but speculative placements of the structures mentioned in the Kharsag Epics on page 313 of the Genius of the Few. And the Great Watercourse, you see the Great Watercourse shown here. Now, O'Brien did all this before we had Google. And Google, look, I've waited for years for that to happen. And right on the Google image, we've got exactly where O'Brien said it would be, on the contours. A great, what I believe is a rock-cut ditch, an incredible watercourse, which you can see from the satellite. Another one there, it's going back from the dam, and Enniel's Great House is here, and it goes out and takes all the stormwater into the Wadi Nirab and drains the basin. But in the summer, when it's always very dry, even now, and certainly was then, this great watercourse acts as a reservoir. Along with this reservoir, it keeps getting topped up, and the water can go through the sluices into the garden, the 4 sluices. And on one of the images, I thought I could definitely see one of the sluices. And on Red Ice Creations about 3 weeks ago, I gave an open invitation for anybody who wants to go to Beirut, get a driver, go down there, talk to the farmers if you can speak the language, and look for yourself, and maybe be the first person to provide some good photographs of it. Another image, these are where O'Brien thought the Watchers' houses may be. They may be emplacements from the war between Hezbollah and the Israelis, I don't know, but it's very interesting, and it looks as though another channel, a watercourse, came in bringing floodwater or stormwater from this direction, because they were clearly desperate to get all the water they could during the summer months, but desperately worried in the winter months that there was going to be too much water from the mountain for this to all flood and fail. But it worked very well. For 3,000 years, it was headquarters for the Anunnaki. Now, favourable conditions of farming after thousands of years of climatic chaos, another key point in our story. This is the rate of temperature change over 100-year intervals since 47,920 BC to the present day. And you can see how hostile the environment was, and then it settled down. And this is our recent time. This is the Holocene, the wholly recent period of time. Key graph to tell you how hostile our planet was up to this point in time when we find agriculture and civilization arising. And good old CO2, if it wasn't for CO2, plants wouldn't grow. People running big greenhouses and want plants to grow pump CO2 into them. The planet is what it is today because of CO2. Water vapor, and we had a lovely talk yesterday about water and the importance of water. Water makes up 86% of the greenhouse gases, and CO2 is a very minor element. And to suggest it has any effect upon our climate, and I can tell you, and you can take it or leave it, the story that we're having at the moment thrust down our throats is utter nonsense. Now, here is the warming, end of the last glacial. And this chart tells us that it was a little bit of a bumpy ride. We didn't really get going until we get to this Holocene climatic optimum here, which is about 4,200. And this is where we begin to find people obviously done well in the Near East, but coming here to Britain. And the fires to clearing land and for grazing animals on Exmoor ties in with about 4,200, which is the top of this peak. And then we get another peak here, about 2,350. And they coincide with these climatic optimums. The sea levels obviously peaked at these high spots, and maybe sea level did in fact go down a bit during the cold spots. And we're down here, so you can see we're nowhere near as warm as we have been. Britain was 2 degrees warmer at the time of Stonehenge was built, and had double the rainfall up on Salisbury Plain, and there was another maybe 1 or 2 feet of good topsoil there as well. The Canaanites, they were also called the Paunch in the Vedas, And the Paunch were heroes who travelled the world, or Aryans, same story, but Hitler used that one and gave them a bad name. And anybody daring to use the word Aryan was struck off the list. Another great tragedy, because the actual word means noble ones. So public relations is still winning the day. The seas have been mastered from the earliest times. Jericho in the Jordan Valley, really important site after Kharsag, and this is the Tel al-Sultan here, and that is the passage or excavation by Kathleen Kenyon in 1954, which gave us a fabulous benchmark on finding a very sophisticated, oldest city in the world at this incredibly early date. Another wonderful clue. And this particular drawing shows that rock-cut ditch better than any other can. It's massive. It's 8 or 9 feet deep, 30 feet wide, and it's through solid rock. So the people who came to Kharsag were capable of cutting through solid rock, both Kharsag and Jericho, and this was the domain of Enki. And there's another picture of it. And my view is, and certainly the design of a tower, which we're going to look at in a minute, would suggest the wall and the ditch were flood prevention, not to make a fort. It was certainly grew into a city. It was very important, central administration, etc. But I don't see any evidence of saying there were wars going on here at all. I think it was built specifically for flood protection in that particular low-lying area. And remember, these people had lived through the most horrific catastrophe. So here we have a great stone tower, and it would have been a trading and production centre for food, salt and bitumen, and probably the Anunnaki headquarters in the Jordan lowlands under Enki. And these excavations represent the benchmark for dating the Holocene evolution of farming and civilization. If you're any kind of researcher or historian, you have to take the Jericho evidence right at the top of the tree to build a chronology and picture of our history. Sadly, very few people have. And this is we see a roof of large slabs, hammer dressed to a flat surface. This is big stones being used at this early date. This tower would not disgrace one of the more grandiose medieval castles, says Kathleen Kenyon, in charge of the excavation. And she says here, the labour involved in excavating this ditch out of solid rock must have been tremendous. So there's evidence of sophistication and great thoroughness and efficiency. Now, this is the big excitement at Gobekli Tepe, largely because somebody's written a book, and it's mostly about human sacrifice and how these people was a cult and how it was religious and temples and all the rest of it. And it may sell very well, I don't know. That's a lot of public like the conspiracy theory stories, but in terms of reality and fact, it doesn't come anywhere near what is actually going on here. And what we have are buildings, walls, thick walls, right on the top, highest point of a ridge, an elongated mountain ridge, about 15 kilometers northeast of Sanhurfa, Urfa in southeast Turkey. And these are roof supports. There are maybe, I think, 100 or more of them, but they're very clearly roof supports. And I didn't think I needed to do any more than show this image to show that these would have been roof supports, and on top would have had an immensely strong roof. Go back to our story about dig a pit, cover it with logs, cover it with soil. Same basic principle. But inside, look at this beauty. Wonderful beauty. And they all think it's a headless man down here, but I really can't see it. But this is just wonderful stuff, absolutely wonderful. Reliefs of vultures, scorpion, and what they have actually are all the basic animals which were in this area at the time. And they were hunter-gatherers, not a scrap of evidence of any agriculture as such. But it was an important settlement. It may well have been a little industrial site. It may well have been an important staging post. It could have been an observation, astronomy point as well for angels and watchers, because they went off in groups and parties literally around the world, setting up places like this so they could then teach the local populations how to farm and how to live and how to do things properly. And most of all, the principal roles for people to live peacefully together. With superb social organisation. When we get to Baalbek, from the very earliest records, we have, that is actually a late tablet. And it says, all we great, it's a copy, obviously, coming down. It says, all we great Anunnaki, or Anunnaki, as O'Brien prefers to call them, which is the correct translation, decided to go on a rule. Anu and Adad would rule the highlands. And this is written by Enlil. Enlil would rule the lowlands. Enlil comes through as Yahweh too, as the god, for many thousands of years. I'm not saying he lived that long. It was a titular title, as they say. Gabriel was a titular title. She was simply the governor of the Garden of Eden. And that goes right through into the Hebrew, where the Gabriel went to visit Mary, the mother of Jesus, to decide on when she would be impregnated to have a son who was eligible for kingship. But that's another story. But look, we just want to see Anu, An or Anu and Adad. He was called Anu in the Akkadian language. The names change, and that makes life a lot more difficult. But even in Sumer, we find a double temple to these two, Anu and Adad. And of course, that's An and Hadad. Very, very interesting. This is the incredible spring. And of course, Jericho had an incredible spring with 1,000 gallons a minute. And this is a similar situation. Water supply was everything in these places. And we know that's important. We know it was important at Avebury, West Kennet. All these stories of people on the Marlborough Downs needed to be near water. And that is the massive platform. And that is the water coming from that spring down that big channel, still there, working today, into a pond here. That was the water supply. And this is what we call a great platform. And we don't know what form it originally took, where the accommodation was, but they built big platforms right from the start. And I'm going to deal with that because there were very good reasons for building a big platform. That's the Roman temple, which came much later. Starting probably, it was based on a Canaanite temple, which may have been older than Solomon's temple, but the Romans flocked to this site from all over the Roman Empire, from India, everywhere. They came here to pay their respects to the gods. And many of you will know that Hadrian rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome out of his respect for the gods. And the gods were absolutely crucially important to people for very good reason. The story got very distorted over time, but the basic reasons for paying your respect to the gods are very recent in terms of our human history, right the way through to 146 AD with Hadrian in Rome, and the Pantheon is now a Roman Catholic Church. And by the way, in St. Peter's in Rome, you've got the Temple of Mithras in the basement. So if you go to Rome, please go to St. Peter's, but go down to the basement and pay your respects to Mithras. Baalbek platform, you see how much like a masterbar it is. And my view is that all the important bits are underneath. They built these platforms, and that's where they stored their valuables. That's where they went to go when there was a threat of cometary debris. There may have been a big threat, and they may have left the big stone of the south, 1,250 tons of it, in the quarry because the threat didn't materialize as they thought it was going to do. But clearly this is a kind of structure which would have stood a massive explosion of 100 hydrogen bombs that wouldn't have blown anything away much. Protection. And so my argument I'm putting forward in this lecture is that all our large megalithic structures in their many forms, we have to look at them as primarily as places to go, rather like wartime Anderson shelters. When the bombs were falling, we went to the best cover we could. And every house in Switzerland compulsorily has a bomb shelter in the basement now with provisions. And it's not just a silly idea in terms of what we are going to be faced with over the next 100 years. This is a little clue, weathering here of the old structure, the Roman structure on top. Very important. And that is the kind of beautiful, beautiful place. The biggest temple ever built on the planet, the tallest columns, and all these columns were made of Aswan, pink Aswan granite, brought all the way from Aswan in Egypt, up here at 3,000 feet above sea level. Absolutely unbelievable. And the whole story here. And of course, underneath that big platform, we know there are rooms and all sorts of things going on, but we haven't quite done the job that the Knight Templars did in Jerusalem, where they buried away for 2 years and found a treasure, or it looks as though they found a treasure in the platform, which was the place to look for treasure. And it still is, for that matter. Other important early sites of sophistication. Hayek, 7,500 BC, that's the occupation mound. Christian O'Brien identified fruit fly chromosomes here, so people were using microscopes and doing biology and studying the fruit fly, which is the key species to study if you're a scientist in going into a new area, new territory, and looking at all the plants and everything. So we have that kind of sophistication going on. And how do they polish a mirror of obsidian without scratching it? And how do they drill holes so small that no fine model needle can penetrate? And that wasn't geopolymers, that was actually rocks which were genuine rocks. They did use geopolymers and did wonderful things with concrete and moulded substances which hardened. So they had, there's just three very interesting technical skills there. Hamilcar, major city in Syria, 6000 BC, there are the bits and pieces. This is the Halafian ceramics and a lovely lady who wrote wonderful books. And that is the sophistication of their pottery, ceramics, which wasn't improved upon until the 18th century. And you find that from, say, 6000 BC to 5000 BC in this area of the Near East. Now, this is from Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings by Charles Hapgood, which Graham Hancock referred to last night. Crucial book, very important. I haven't dealt with any of the map issues, but we know the world and the sky was mapped in incredible detail as early as we have records and even earlier. And this is the pyramid which Hapgood identified as certainly being the oldest pyramid in the world. And the reason for that was various lava flows that had covered the footings of this building. And this was taken by Gary Bilcliffe. And Gary Bilcliffe is part of our, if you like, our group, and has done wonderful lectures on the Etruscans and this early megalithic work. And I'm going to show two of his favourite slides in a minute. Now, you like this one. Where did you get that hat? And I've just shown that after the Mexico shot, because this is what we find not only in the Phoenicia and Turkey, but also in Palenque and Veracruz and Mexico. And you can see the similarity of the hats here. And this was about this time. We're talking about the Old Kingdom time, 2900, 3000 BC, these hats. And they were very fashionable. And Mithras had a hat like that too. And I think you've all seen hats like that in history. But it's a wonderful drawing by a lady called Ruth Ferrell, who was part of this Verrill and Verrill team who wrote Ancient American Civilizations, an absolutely essential read, the best book on ancient American civilizations. And I've just received the proof, all the documents ready to go to print, Four Gods Who Were Men, which was handed by Ruth Ferrell to Bernard Dallaire before she died. It's a sensational book and opens up all kinds of interesting avenues about what was happening in the Americas and how crazy we are to think that we weren't there thousands of years ago, because we were and our ancestors were. Well, I say we were because we're part of our ancestors. Development in Sumeria. This is the reason for the genius of the few was this incredible archaeologist called Andre Perret. I'm not going to run any archaeologists down, but there were some outstanding people, Flinders Petrie, for example, and Samuel Noah Kramer. But this is his quote. Now that we can view the Mesopotamian basin in all its splendor, it's becoming clear that this flame that blazed so suddenly in the Middle East and shed so wide a light was kindled at several points, each with its own nuisance and distinctive luster. Susa, Lagash, Ur, Uruk, Ashnukak, Assa, Nineveh, Mari, all alike were centers whose civilization advanced from strength until, thanks to the genius of the few and the boldness of the many, there was wrought forth, as in an alchemist's crucible, a prodigious many-sided art. And that was O'Brien's favourite quote from those times and why he called the book The Genius of the Few. And what did we find at Uruk? Dates now 4,500 B to 3,250 BC. We find a Tamon dedicated to An. Now, the word temple comes from Taman, but Taman just simply meant a sacred area. And it was always a sacred area to these gods who had delivered civilization to us. And that was the tradition that followed down. It's very, very important to realize that they didn't have a religion as such. They had a way of doing things. And this is what the Egyptians, a way of doing things. It was a damn good way of doing things. And the same with the Druids. It's a way of doing things. And the Druid links go right back to this Kharsag site through people like Ugmash, Shamash, Ogimus, and you can see the links there. The Druids were the descendants of the Tuatha De Nan, and Tuatha De Nan, the people of the god An. We have all these links going back through, which are very important. And the last lecture was interesting because we're looking at how religion has taken so much of the old order and converted into a Christian viewpoint. And if we can just go back to 3000, 4000 BC, we can see how so many of these stories have been distorted, but there's a lot of basic truths there. So we mustn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, as they say. Uruk again, and that there was a white temple on top of a building just this big in this town, which was the white temple to An. And that just shows you what's there now. This is where the Kharsag Epics were found, which is in the Nippur Library, which was excavated. Fortunately, it was destroyed, but clay tablets don't burn. They might break up a bit, but they managed to rescue a fantastic amount of information from the Nippur Library, a crucial area. And still nobody really knows how to translate it. And the point is that O'Brien took on this particular job. I went to an international conference on the Phaistos disk and was appalled to find not one person who really understood what the very early the vertical picture signs was all about and how far back they go, and how that was quite separate from the Aleph Beg, which was the in-house speedy writing of Enoch. And these are the areas where you've got farming on those rivers, irrigated farming. Nippur is there, and Shuruppak was a great administrative centre where the kings used to go for the council of kings. The Druids used to come back to these areas early on to have council meetings every year so that they ran everything. And when things were in trouble, they appointed a king of kings, so the Shishak, or an Ozymandias, or a Brabwald in Saxon times, or a Pendragon in England. This is where we get these stories from and where they come. It's all back to this incredible social organisation here, going back a long way. But a population, the same time that Stonehenge was being built and the pyramids were being built, we had a population at Shuruppak of between 15,000 and 30,000 people in an area of about 100 hectares, with a city wall and developed military organisation, and the soldiers were there to protect the farmers. Transport in Sumeria, a little bit from Zechariah Sitchin, who made lots of contributions but got the wrong end of the stick, and his translation of cuneiform was based on older, later material, and he didn't attempt to go back to the beginning as Christian O'Brien did, and therefore he was in real trouble. And this is the story from the Indus Valley to Dolivera town, a wonderful city on the Indus Valley. And you've got the Indus Valley was colonized by the Sumerians, and when the river flooded, they filled the chambers of water. Lothal, and then you go off across the Pacific in these double-hulled canoes. This is what you find on the way. The Pacific is full of the most fantastic megaliths, and I picked that one out because I think it's unique. And there were rows of these, 10 pillars either side, and 2 rows, and must have had a roof on it of some kind. This is the soup where you would have landed on the coast of Peru, and then from down the Amazon you were having people coming the other way, and massive farming and food production coming from the other direction down the Amazon River. This is the small spider, which has its reproductive organ on its leg, and you can only see it. You can't see it without using a microscope. Very, very interesting point. So these people had microscopes, they were doing all the science. Megalithic structures again, terraces, terrific megalith structures here. I'm not quite sure how tall these are, but these ones here, many of them are over 11 or 12 feet high, and they've never moved from the time they were built through earthquakes or anything else. Fantastic system of land management and farming management, all labour intensive, very effective because they could put just the right amount of water on their crops. China here, quite extraordinary features. Now, if it wasn't worth doing, they wouldn't have done it. Gary-Bill Cliff with an Etruscan polygonal tower, only one like it outside Bolivia. We think that architecture, megalithic structure, is common to South America. It's not, because it came from the Etruscans and the Pelagesians. And here is a Pelagesian wall in Greece, which Gary's photographed, 5 miles of wall, and some of the biggest stones are at the top. Absolutely sensational. And his work is marvellous. You can look at his work on the Holistic Channel and on the DVDs. A pyramid in Greece, same kind of story. Old Kingdom Egypt, we've got Saqqara, and the wall around Saqqara is virtually identical to this wall here at Kish. Almost the same building families would have come to Egypt because the Sumerians came to Egypt. That's why everything is there right from the start, because it was moved from Sumeria to Egypt. So the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids, the Sumerians did, the Aryan Sumerians built it, or built them. And at the same time as they were building pyramids in Egypt, we've got this kind of step pyramid, same dates, in the Chiquima Valley, Peru, to show the point that they were all around the world. And these mud brick structures are still there today, absolutely fun, 7,000 years later. Xhosa at Saqqara. And underneath Saqqara, we've got these enormous structures underneath Saqqara. And this, in my mind, proves absolutely conclusively that these structures were to hide from the wrath of God. And this is what we hear about the big platforms, that it was, they were built to hide from the wrath of God, which was the cometary debris, cometary catastrophe. An enormous number of people, facilities, maybe air, water, all the things needed for a real blast. And at this particular time, they built all the pyramids within about 100 years to very high specifications. It was not for dead people. It was to keep the population, of many of the population as possible, alive. And if they couldn't get into the pyramids, they'd get into the mastabas and all the surrounding structures. Granite, possibly machined. This is an interesting image just to show you more sophistication at Giza. And this made my mind up that these buildings were for, if you like, Anderson shelters, bomb shelters. And so we've got, in the middle of that, a terrific amount of space. That's looking down the shaft, into it. That's looking up the shaft. And the Americas, we've got Tiwanaku again, not far from Lake Titicaca. Pumapunka was the port. Extraordinary structure there, and I put this in because I wanted to show you megaliths, look, big stones, and in between them they're filled in with a much later brick wall. Very interesting. I'm sure this happened a lot in Britain with our stones and our stone circles. This is a particularly important point. This is the kind of landscape we see as the remains of early farming, what's left on the ground. And this is all around this great Lake Titicaca basin, 54,000 square kilometers, and up on the hills where they cleared all the stones for their grazing animals, massive walls, and nobody really understands what they are, but I'm absolutely convinced that they're all part of the whole farming system. This is for growing the crops, and the uplands and the hills were for the grazing animals. Sandstone brought 20 kilometers, 200, 300 tons. Massive slabs at Pumapunka, 150, 200 tons, and there was an earthquake at that time, so maybe this was built before that earthquake. This is a famous fort, as you know. There are two images. That is the close-up, and that is a more distant view here on the hill above Cusco. You've seen these wonderful images, just breathtaking, really. In Egypt, this is at Ardis in Syria. Some of the biggest blocks you'll ever find anywhere on the planet was built just to wall in an island, the Ruad Island in Syria. The Osiron at Abydos, that was clearly, as were all the Abydos so-called tombs, they were specifically organized for people to go and take cover. And this was from about 3,200, 3,300 BC when we have this called Scorpion Kings in Egypt. Malta, same story, corbelled roof, everything they could to rebuild or build something that was very efficient inside, but as strong as a cave. And of course the valley temples, there's the Sphinx, and these are the two temples, and these were built from the material excavated here. So these are as old as the Sphinx, however old the Sphinx is. On the Golden Heights, we got this extraordinary structure to 42,000 tons of uncut black volcanic basalt, fieldstones, all piled up here. This is what a typical passage grave looks like, and a specification of how they were originally designed. And we've got a confirmation of that here, all the many different types of chambers, but my belief is they were totally practical, very important. The platforms, Baalbek, and this was a platform was built by Cain to hide from the wrath of God. This temple in Cyprus, I haven't got a picture of it, it's really a tamer, but the point is, look how big it is. It's 630 feet broad in a 240 by 165, so 700 by 650 feet. And the bluish granite had to be imported from Egypt or Cilicia. And the blocks are extraordinarily large, 16 by 8. How did they do it? This is the other story here. Mythology says that both Baalbek and Persepolis structures were built on the instructions of Jin Bin, which means Jin, son of Jan. So Jin, son of An, as lurking places for the genii to hide, because genii is an Arabic word for the shining ones. And this has many stages of development. So the original structure, the same, was built as a lurking place for the genii to hide from the wrath of God. Massive platform here at Tula much later with the sacred baskets, which we find all over the world, following on from the Sumerian tradition. Tiryns, very interesting. We've got a Megaron here, which is a central place where the royal family go when the sky is falling, so that they're really safe in a small central shelter. Terrific platform here. This is 200 meters square and about 30 or 40 feet high at least. Massive staircases and columns all the way around it. But the really important parts would have been underneath there, rather like the platform at Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, Palmyra, Damascus, Baalbek were all temples to Baal. It's Baal Hadad, and we saw Hadad earlier. Osirion is now flooded, but look, we've got the mortise and tenon joints here, and this was clearly meant to be a roof structure. Here we are again, mortise and tenon joints. And where do we find those? Stonehenge. And even greater sophistication with the stonework in a different way, more artistic way here. Each upright has two small tenons, and each lintel has matching mortises, plus tongue and groove joints at each end. The circular span of lintels, therefore, formed an immensely strong supporting base for a wooden roof. To enhance the visual effect of the stone structure, the uprights were shaped in such a way to overcome the harsh lines or otherwise unattractive angular features. When built, the temperature was 2 degrees warmer and much wetter than today. More than 12 inches of topsoil would have been lost on the surrounding farm and grazing lands since the peak activity around 2400 BC. The recent discovery of massive timbers put in vertically near Woodhenge and then moved might be a clue to the fact that that timber or some of that timber was used in building the roof for Stonehenge. Several engineers have all said that had to have a roof, and of course we know all those structures around the world. We see the basic roof supports, but the timber rots and therefore the evidence of the timber disappears. But any building engineer, any surveyor, anybody who puts buildings up would recognize that as a massive roofed structure. There probably was a lot of accommodation in the roof. The roof would have been covered with a lot of stone and earth, particularly earth, and it would have been there to be able to provide a very cool environment for all the goods, particularly perishable goods, that came in the markets which took place in Stonehenge. The idea of a temple, no. Meeting place, yes. Place for people to go for healing, yes. Different markets for different goods all through the week, dealing with the 7 groupings of peoples in the whole of the area from Stonehenge and Salisbury Plain south. And you've got a situation where that was a principal building which had a specific purpose. And it had its roof put on round about 2600, which is the time that we saw the Great Pyramids being built on the Giza Plateau, because of this worry of cometary debris coming in, which it did at 2345. So massive roof, overhanging structures to allow people to display their goods, a meeting place for the Druid Council. All the activities of the community would have taken place there. And these mortise and tenons and the way the the building was shaped. It shows superb engineering skills. And to have that without a roof doesn't make any kind of sense at all. The Stonehenge Curses. Now, my suggestion here is that we find a few agronomists to work out what was going on. And we know that there were a lot of trees, the land was gradually cleared, the great wild ox was around, which would have been a terrible problem for the cattle, and there would have been the lynx and wolves, etc., which would have preyed upon the sheep and cattle. So they would have had to come in at night. And most of the very important Bronze Age camps had the various ditches around them, which were grazing areas and also gave protection, and were sites of large fences to make sure that livestock, sheep and cattle, could come in at night and the whole operation could be well protected, particularly those fields which they were using to grow their crops. They didn't want the wild animals in their crops or their own animals disturbed, but what they would have done was, where they brought the animals in at night, in those areas the cattle would have dunged those enclosures, and then they would have rotated the enclosures, and then they would have planted their important vegetables, crops in those dunged compartments. We still see that all over the country in Britain and in Scotland, where seaweed was used to fertilise as well as dung, but it was getting the animals in where they dung. Same all over Africa, same basic principle. These are all very fundamental methods of farming which we can trace around the world. So the cursus was simply extended as more and more people arrived in the area. And it would have been earlier than almost anything else, because their food and their survival and their animals really is what kept them alive. Now, the purpose of the Bluestones placed in a circle at Stonehenge is important. We know that in the earlier stages, 3100, 3200, the Bluestones were in fact in a much wider circle outside the current Sarsen stones. And the Sarsens, of course, came from further north, 20 miles north, and had to be carried down and weighed, I don't know how much they weighed, 70 tons, 50 tons. But the Bluestones all match a particular type of bluestone in the Preseli Mountains. And what's important about these bluestones is that they have the highest concentration of monatomic elements, which are the crucial elements created by cometary debris impacts. And what's important there is that the people in the ancient past understood geology and science, much of it far more than we do even today. And what they were using the bluestones for was to create a field, electric and magnetic field in a circle. And if you got into that field, then you could balance your brain waves. It's called Neuroelectric Therapy or something similar. There are various versions of it now, and if you balance the brain waves, then the body heals itself. So if Stonehenge was the place to go for healing, that all makes sense, and of course that's what a lot of even the archaeologists are now admitting, that people went there for healing, and the Druids did at least run a health service for people, and their health service was a method by which brain waves could be balanced and they healed, or their bodies healed themselves. Now that may seem far-fetched, but there are many parallels which we can follow to link that to what modern research is finding out today. That is a broken bluestone below the Preseli peaks, showing white fleck, which when polished would have looked spectacular. These stones, created by the heat of cometary impacts, have the highest percentage of monatomic elements and are unique to this location, Preseli. So they only place in the whole of the British Isles where you find them. So these people identified those special rocks and took them to the area of Stonehenge, and it wouldn't have been too difficult with the smaller stones. They could have soon made a wooden cage to literally roll them rather than take them by boat. I would personally think they turned them into cartwheels and carried the stones but on the axles and carried them with oxen. That would have seemed to me to be a perfectly satisfactory way to move stones of great value from Preseli to Stonehenge. Well, the Druids at Stonehenge provided a free medical service, part of which was the use of electric fields to balance brain waves and repair damaged brain receptors. Today, this repairing of brain receptors is called neuroelectric therapy. We're beginning to understand that such treatment allows the body to heal itself from a wide range of life-threatening medical conditions. This is just an example of a lady called Liz. After 10 years on heroin, Liz found her appearance changing during the first week of neuroelectric therapy, which is called NET. These pictures were taken on days 1, 3 and 6. This is from an article in the Independent magazine called The Cure by Claude Valelli on the 17th of March 2007. And you can see an amazing difference in 6 days of this lady's face on this treatment when her receptors and connections were aligned. That's what it is. You hang it round your waist, you wear it for a week, plaster the electrodes behind your ears, sleep in it for 7 days, and that's the cure. Unfortunately, you have to have permission of the individual to be able to use that kind of treatment, but we've got to wake up to its importance. It's a very low voltage and it has amazing results. Won special awards in America, is being used in several countries around the world very successfully. And this is inside the meditating brain and the technical information as to how the brain works, and we're learning more about this all the time, and it dovetailing in with encouraging our brain and our body to heal itself. The brain waves are beta, alpha, theta, delta, deep delta. And this is what we see on the ancient, this is the Gunstrup cauldron, plate for the Gunstrup cauldron, is a man, Cernos, in a meditation or yoga position with the animals. It's not the wild hunt, it's a guy meditating, very clear. Meditation is part of this process and understanding this process. Now, where did our brilliant and benevolent ancestors come from? And I'm really going to stretch everybody's mind here. Did they come from Atlantis, or did they come from Mars? Or perhaps they came from Mars to Atlantis, perhaps they went from Atlantis to Mars. But we must keep open minds and look at all the features and factors, which mean that there are several possibilities. Now, this is an image of Atlantis on the site of the Azores, and this is a first-class work on geology by Christian O'Brien, who is one of the world's leading exploration geologists. Now, the image of Mars, which is our second alternative to Atlantis, the Mars image right is much more representative of the true Mars globe as compared to the usual strong orange-red colours. Note that this image is complete with atmospheric haze and clouds. Our global perception of a dry and dust scenario has been manipulated. Now, this is something called MarsAnomalyResearch.com by J.P. Skipper. Now, this is an image from the University of Colorado scientists, and Mars as it once looked with water. They've identified 52 delta regions fed by river-like systems, all at the same height, so may have marked the shoreline of an ocean. They wrote this on Nature Geoscience. And then we've got this extraordinary hail crater on Mars. And remember, what we're now talking about, up to date, this was in 2007 I think, we're now up to date 2016, and we know that there's loads of evidence of water on Mars and life on Mars, and the consensus, I believe, amongst some of us is that Mars lost its atmosphere at the same time that the Earth's atmosphere was hit very hard at this catastrophe date of 10,850. when a very large object passed close to the Earth and the Earth tipped on its axis by about 15 degrees to move the North Pole from the Hudson Bay area to where it is at the moment. And so we had this supernova debris coming through our planetary system, disrupting, moving Venus off course, almost certainly disrupting the atmospheres of both Mars and the Earth. And remember, Mars is our closest neighbour. And so we're now beginning to look at the possibility that up till 10,850 years BC, Mars in fact could have been populated by people just like us. Now we're enlarging here the Mars crater, the Hale crater, and we're just beginning to see some very strange looking man-made like images on this photo, which we can blow up even more and keep blowing up. And again, and we've got something that looks man-made like. And further on we go, it's gradually enlarging. And then we get here the images provided by Mars Anomaly Research, and we've got very clearly features remaining there of civilization of some kind. And it may be distortions in the lens, I doubt it. Just have a close look yourself. But this is one of the most interesting things that I've seen, and I believe that modern science is catching up with the possibility that we may well have had sophisticated people living on Mars in relatively recent times. Was Mars our nearest neighbour, very much like the Earth now, and was its atmosphere destroyed at the time when the Earth was tipped on its axis and lost half its atmosphere around 10,850? That's the end of that, and leaving everybody with quite an interesting question and work for modern scientists, and I haven't yet heard anybody refute that particular prognosis. Thank you.